There are corners of England where the air itself seems burdened by memory, where ivy clings too tightly, and the wind carries voices one swears were never living. Among the many strange affairs I chronicled beside Mr. Sherlock Holmes, few have left me with a chill so enduring as the one I have titled The Bell of Ravenscroft. It was the bleak heart of winter when the summons came. Frost on the panes of Baker Street, the city crouched beneath its mantle of smoke and silence. A letter sealed in black wax spoke of a church whose bell had long been shattered by lightning, and yet, on nights of storm and moonlight, it tolled, not for the dead, but for those yet living. What began as a tale of superstition and sorrow soon revealed itself to be a masterpiece of deception, where fear was the instrument, and reason the only defence against its toll. In the quiet lanes of Sussex, beneath a tower whose shadow marked the snow like a wound, Holmes and I would come face to face with a crime as cold and resonant as the bell itself. This, then, is the account I have set down as Sherlock Holmes and the Adventure of the Bell of Ravenscroft. You're listening to Detective Street, where untold mysteries find their voice. And if you enjoy this story, consider subscribing and share in the comments where in the world you're listening from. Chapter 1. The Summons of the Silent Bell. The winter of 1891 had settled upon London with a severity that seemed to mirror the rigid propriety of our late sovereign's declining years. Ice glazed the cobblestones of Baker Street, and the yellow fog that rolled in from the Thames carried with it the acrid tang of 10,000 coal fires. It was a morning that invited contemplation rather than action, and I found my friend Sherlock Holmes engaged in precisely such an occupation when I descended to our sitting-room shortly after 9 o'clock. He lay upon the settee, attired in his mouse-coloured dressing-gown, his lean frame stretched in an attitude of such complete repose that a casual observer might have supposed him asleep. Yet I, who had witnessed this peculiar state many times before, recognized in the slight tension of his interlaced fingers and the barely perceptible movement beneath his closed eyelids the signs of intense mental activity. The fire that our excellent Mrs. Hudson had coaxed into cheerful life threw dancing shadows across the chemical apparatus that cluttered our mantelpiece, retorts, beakers, and spirit lamps arranged in that organized chaos that was uniquely Holmes's own. I had scarce settled into my chair with the morning papers when Holmes spoke, his eyes remaining closed. "You perceive, Watson, that within the next few minutes we shall receive a visitor of considerable agitation, accompanied by a gentleman of the cloth. The former walks with a mixture of breeding and rural inexperience. I detect the hesitation of one accustomed to drawing-rooms, yet presently hampered by boots more suited to country lanes than London pavements. The latter has the measured tread of one who walks often in procession. I had long since abandoned any pretense of surprise at these demonstrations, though they never failed to intrigue me. Your reasoning? I inquired, setting aside my paper. Simplicity itself. I have been listening to their approach for the past minute. The lady's step, for it is a lady, as the lightness of the tread suggests, shows hesitation at the curb, then a firmer resolution upon our doorstep. The clergyman's pace is perfectly regular, as one might expect from years of measured progress down a church aisle. As for their agitation, Mrs. Hudson has been hovering outside our door for 30 seconds, gathering the courage to interrupt what she imagines to be my rest. Even as he spoke, a knock sounded upon our door, and our landlady entered to announce a Miss Elinor Ravenscroft and the Reverend Mr. Pritchard. Holmes sat upright with that sudden feline energy that was characteristic of him, transforming in an instant from languid philosopher to alert investigator. Our visitors entered in a state that fully justified Holmes's prediction of agitation. The lady was perhaps 25, possessed of that particular English beauty that combines delicacy with resolution. Her travelling cloak bore the fine white powder of hoar-frost, and her gloved hands clutched at a small reticule with a tension that spoke of nerves held in check only by considerable force of will. Her companion was a man of middle years, with the honest, open countenance and slightly stooped shoulders of a country vicar who has spent many hours in study and in ministering to his flock. "Mr. Holmes," the lady began, her voice admirably steady despite the circumstances, "I am Elinor Ravenscroft, of Ravenscroft House near Withycombe in Sussex. This is Mr. Pritchard, vicar of our parish church, St. Mark's. We have travelled through the night to consult you upon a matter that—" Here her composure faltered slightly. "Upon a matter that defies rational explanation, yet threatens the very peace of our household." "Pray be seated, Miss Ravenscroft," Holmes replied, indicating chairs near the fire. "Dr. Watson, whom you see before you, is my colleague and chronicler. You may speak freely in his presence. I perceive that your matter concerns St. Mark's Church. The dust upon your sleeve is limestone, such as is used in the construction of Norman churches, and carries with it a faint smell of mildew that suggests a bell tower. The church has not been in regular use for some time, or the dust would not have accumulated so." The vicar leaned forward, his face grave. "You are correct in part, Mr. Holmes. The body of the church sees weekly service, but the tower and belfry have been sealed these 23 years. The bell, the great bell that once called our parish to worship, was struck by lightning in the summer of 1868. The bolt cracked the bell from crown to shoulder, rendering it useless for its purpose. More than that, sir, it was deemed dangerous. The timbers were scorched, and there was fear that the bell itself might fall. We chained the clapper to prevent any attempt at ringing, padlocked the chain, and I myself have kept the only key upon my person since taking up my living 6 years ago." "A sensible precaution," Holmes observed, "yet I deduce that this sealed and silenced bell has recently made itself heard." Miss Ravenscroft's pale face grew, if possible, paler still. "It rang last night, Mr. Holmes. 3 times it told, slow, deliberate strokes that echoed across the parish and set every dog within a mile to howling. I was in the drawing-room with my aunt when it began. The first stroke seemed to come from the very earth itself. So deep and sonorous it was. The windows rattled in their frames. By the 3rd stroke, half the household had gathered in the hall, and the servants were in a state approaching panic." "You speak of your aunt," Holmes interjected. "That would be Lady Agatha Ravenscroft, widow of Sir Julius. I recall reading of his death some months ago. October, I believe." A shadow crossed the lady's face. "Sir Julius was my guardian. He died last Michaelmas, the 29th of September. He fell from the church tower during an inspection of the damage. The coroner returned a verdict of misadventure, concluding that he had leaned too far out between the louvers and lost his balance." She paused, then added in a lower voice, "There is a legend in our family, Mr. Holmes. They say that when the bell of St. Mark's tolls 3 times, death follows. Holmes steepled his long fingers, his grey eyes intent. And has death followed upon this latest manifestation? Not death, thank Providence, the vicar replied, though it came perilously close. Our servant Alice, a girl of barely 19 years, was so overcome by the sound that she collapsed and struck her head upon the stone floor of the passage. Dr. Carruthers fears a concussion, though she has since regained her senses. The household, however, is in a state of such disorder that Miss Ravenscroft felt it imperative to consult you at once. Holmes rose and began to pace before the fire, his hands clasped behind his back, a sure sign that his interest was thoroughly engaged. This legend of which you speak, Miss Ravenscroft, has it foundation in fact, or is it merely the sort of colourful folklore that attaches itself to old families and older houses? It is difficult to separate truth from embellishment after so many generations, she replied. The bell was cast in 1523, during the reign of Henry VIII. According to family records, it tolled unbidden on the night before the execution of Sir Edmund Ravenscroft in 1587. He was convicted of treason against Queen Elizabeth. Again in 1746, when Sir William Ravenscroft was killed at Culloden, and once more in 1815, when my grandfather's elder brother drowned in a boating accident upon the Serpentine. Each time, 3 strokes. A remarkable consistency, Holmes murmured. And yet bells do not toll themselves, Miss Ravenscroft, any more than pistols fire without hands to pull their triggers. Tell me, who resides at Ravenscroft House besides yourself and Lady Agatha? There is my cousin, Mr. Lionel Hawksmoor, Sir Julius's nephew, and our nearest relation. He has resided with us since last spring, when certain financial reverses obliged him to close his London rooms. Then we have the household staff, Mrs. Chalice, our housekeeper, Mr. Cobb, who serves as steward and has been with the family these 20 years, Alice, of whom I have spoken, and 2 other maids, Mary and Sarah, who are sisters. Holmes turned to face our visitors, his decision made. Watson, I believe a day or 2 in the Sussex countryside may prove beneficial to our health. The London fogs play havoc with my respiratory system. To Miss Ravenscroft and the vicar, he continued, we shall take the afternoon train to Withycombe. Telegraph your household to expect our arrival by evening. In the meantime, I should like you to furnish me with any additional details that may prove relevant. The layout of the house and church, the position of Sir Julius's body when it was discovered, and the exact sequence of events surrounding last night's manifestation. For the next hour, Holmes subjected our visitors to a searching examination, extracting details with the precision of a surgeon removing a bullet from a wound. He learned that Ravenscroft House stood a 1/4 mile from the church, connected by an ancient avenue of yew trees, that Sir Julius had been found at the base of the tower's north face, upon ground so hard with frost that his fatal injuries might as easily have resulted from the fall as from any prior violence, that no one had been seen entering or leaving the tower on the night of his death, though one parishioner, old Tom Burdock, the sexton, claimed to have heard a single muffled stroke from the bell around the hour of 9 o'clock. When at last our visitors departed to arrange their return journey, I turned to Holmes with the question that had been forming in my mind throughout the interview. You suspect foul play in Sir Julius's death. I suspect nothing yet, Watson, though I observe several suggestive features. A man does not inspect a dangerous tower alone, at night without its powerful inducement. The single stroke that old Burdock heard, if indeed he heard it and did not imagine it, suggests an experiment, a trial of some mechanism. And Miss Ravenscroft's anxiety extends beyond mere superstitious fear. There is something more at stake here than the manifestation of a ghostly bell. The estate, perhaps? Precisely, Watson. You continue to improve. There is always money at the root of these affairs, and an heiress at 25 is a prize worth the playing of several hands. He reached for his pipe and tobacco pouch. But we must not theorize in advance of our data. Let us pack our bags and prepare for a journey into the Sussex countryside. I have a fancy that we may find more than one mystery waiting for us at Ravenscroft House. Thus it was that within a few hours we found ourselves aboard the afternoon train, rattling southward through a landscape transformed by winter into a study in blacks and whites. As London fell away behind us, and the frozen fields of Surrey and Sussex spread before us, I could not shake the feeling that we were travelling not merely into the countryside, but into the past, into a world where ancient bells might toll and ancient curses might hold sway over the living. Holmes, for his part, sat in silence, his eyes half closed, his fingers moving occasionally as though conducting an invisible orchestra. I knew that behind that impassive brow he was already assembling the pieces of a puzzle that I could not yet perceive. Chapter 2. The Belfry and the Household. We alighted at Withycombe Station as the winter dusk was falling, transforming the landscape into a palette of deepening blues and purples. A trap had been sent to collect us, driven by a taciturn man who identified himself as Simmons, the outdoor man at Ravenscroft House. Our journey took us along lanes bordered by high hedges, thick with ice, through a countryside that seemed to hold its breath in the cold. The naked branches of oak and ash stood stark against the darkening sky, and once I glimpsed a barn owl, ghostly pale, sweeping low across a field in search of prey. Ravenscroft House revealed itself gradually as we rounded a final bend, first the tops of its chimneys, then the bulk of the building itself emerging from a protective stand of ancient yews. It was a substantial Georgian mansion, built of grey stone, that seemed to absorb rather than reflect what little light remained in the sky. The facade was symmetrical and severe, with tall windows that stared like blank eyes across lawns shaved to velvet smoothness despite the season. To the left, perhaps 300 yards distant and connected to the main house by that avenue of yews Miss Ravenscroft had mentioned, stood the church of St. Mark's, a squat Norman structure whose square tower thrust upward with the blunt determination of a raised fist. We were received at the entrance by Mrs. Chalice, the housekeeper, a woman of perhaps 50 years, whose tight-lipped expression and ramrod posture suggested that she ruled the domestic realm with iron discipline. She conducted us to a drawing-room, where the rest of the household had assembled to greet us, and where a fire burned with such fierceness that I suspected it had been deliberately stoked to compensate for the chill that seemed to emanate from the very walls. Lady Agatha Ravenscroft sat near the fire, a woman of middle years whose beauty had not so much faded as been extinguished, leaving behind features that seemed incapable of expressing anything beyond a perpetual melancholy. She acknowledged our introduction with a vague inclination of her head, her fingers plucking restlessly at a black handkerchief. Miss Elinor performed the introductions with admirable composure, and I observed Holmes's keen gaze cataloguing each member of the household as though they were specimens in some scientific collection. There was Mr. Cobb, the steward, a thick-set man with shrewd eyes and hands stained with ink. Alice, the unfortunate maid who had suffered the collapse, now recovered, but still pale and starting at every sound. And finally, Mr. Lionel Hawksmoor. Here was a figure who immediately commanded attention, though not through any physical imposing quality. He was a spare man of perhaps 35 years, with the elegant hands of a pianist and a face of studied melancholy that seemed calculated to attract sympathetic attention. His dress was meticulous, perhaps too meticulous for a man in reduced circumstances, and when he spoke, his voice carried that particular blend of refinement and resignation that marks those who have known better days. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said, advancing with outstretched hand, "I am grieved that such distressing circumstances should have necessitated your journey. My cousin Elinor, I fear, has been prey to the superstitions that infect this old house like dry rot. However," and here he paused with theatrical effect, "I cannot deny that last night's manifestation was beyond the ordinary course of nature. I am a man of modern sensibilities, gentlemen. Yet I confess that when I heard those 3 strokes boom across the darkness, I felt as our ancestors must have felt when they believed themselves in the presence of the supernatural." Holmes's expression remained non-committal. "You heard the strokes clearly, Mr. Hawksmoor?" "As clearly as I hear my own voice. I was in my study. I maintain a small room adjoining the library where I pursue my modest musical interests. The first stroke seemed to shake the very foundations. The second rattled the window panes. By the third, I had rushed out to join the others in the hall." "You are musical, then?" Holmes inquired, with that air of casual interest that I knew often preceded some crucial observation. "I play the violin in an amateur fashion, a consolation in times of adversity. I also compose a little, though nothing that would interest a wider audience. The quiet of the countryside suits such pursuits when it is not shattered by manifestations from beyond the grave." This last was delivered with a wry smile that seemed to invite us to appreciate his wit. Miss Elinor interjected, "Mr. Hawksmoor has been urging me to consider whether the burden of maintaining Ravenscroft House is not too great for a woman alone. He believes that these recent events are evidence of a decline that cannot be arrested." "A decline?" Holmes's eyebrows rose slightly. Hawksmoor spread his elegant hands in a gesture that seemed to encompass the entire estate. "The old house is a tyrant, Mr. Holmes. It demands constant attention, endless expense. My late uncle, I fear, had allowed certain economies that have resulted in structural weaknesses. The incident with the bell tower is merely the most dramatic example. I have suggested to my cousin that she might find greater happiness and certainly greater security were she to relinquish the property upon reaching her majority." "Which occurs?" "In April," Miss Elinor replied firmly, "upon my 25th birthday. Until that time, I am bound by the terms of my guardian's will to remain in residence or forfeit the inheritance." Holmes nodded slowly, filing away this information with all the rest. "And should Miss Ravenscroft choose not to maintain residence, or should she die before reaching her majority, the estate would pass." "To myself, as next of kin," Hawksmoor acknowledged. "A responsibility I would accept. With considerable reluctance, I assure you, though I would feel bound by duty to the family name." The vicar, who had remained silent throughout these exchanges, now cleared his throat. Mr. Holmes, daylight is fading quickly. If you wish to examine the tower and belfry, we should proceed without delay. I have brought the key to the padlock, as you requested." Holmes rose at once. "Excellent. Watson, you will accompany us. I believe a medical man's perspective may prove valuable." We wrapped ourselves against the cold and followed Mr. Pritchard out through a side entrance and along the yew avenue. The trees were ancient, perhaps 3 centuries old, and had been trained into fantastic shapes that loomed like misshapen giants in the gathering darkness. The branches met overhead, creating a tunnel through which the wind moaned with a sound that was almost human in its melancholy. The church of St. Mark's was reached through a lich-gate of weathered oak, beyond which lay a graveyard, crowded with tilting headstones. The church itself was of that solid Norman construction that seems to promise endurance unto the ages. Thick walls of the same grey stone as the house, narrow windows like suspicious eyes, and the square tower rising from the western end like a fortress keep. Mr. Pritchard produced a heavy key and unlocked the low door that gave access to the tower's interior. We found ourselves in a space that smelled of ancient stone and rotting timber, where the temperature seemed to have fallen below that of the open air. A narrow spiral staircase wound upward into darkness, the steps worn into dangerous curves by centuries of feet. "Mind your heads, gentlemen," the vicar cautioned as we began our ascent. "The stairs are treacherous, and the stone sweats moisture that has frozen in places." It was a claustrophobic climb, and I found myself counting the steps, 47 in all, before we emerged into the ringing chamber. This was a square room with openings on each wall that had once held the bell ropes. The floor was thick with the droppings of pigeons that had found entry through the louvers above, and in one corner lay a pile of debris that might once have been furniture or scaffolding. Above us, dimly visible in the light of the vicar's lantern, hung the great bell. Even in the uncertain illumination, I could see the jagged black scar that ran from its crown downward. The lightning's autograph. Through the clapper's eye, someone had passed a heavy chain which was secured to the bell frame with a padlock of substantial construction. Holmes produced his lens and spent several minutes in examination, moving with the care of a surgeon exploring a wound. He inspected the chain, the padlock, the bell's supporting timbers, and particularly the area around the louvers. Once he paused to run his finger along the wooden beam, then held it to the light of the lantern. "Observe, Watson," he said softly. "Grey smears upon the timber. Whiting, or plaster, I should say. And here, upon the stair rail, do you see this greenish powder?" I peered at the substance he indicated. "Verdigris?" "Precisely. The green powder that forms upon weathered bronze. Someone has been in recent contact with the bell itself and has carried traces of it away upon their person." He turned to the vicar. "This padlock? You are certain you hold the only key?" "I am, Mr. Holmes. It was placed here under Sir Julius's direction in 1868, when I was but a boy. When I took up this living 6 years ago, the church wardens entrusted the key to me, and I have kept it upon my person without fail." "Yet chains may be unlocked by other means than keys," Holmes murmured. He leaned out through one of the louvers, peering down towards the yew avenue and the house beyond. The view was commanding. One could see directly into several ground-floor windows of Ravenscroft House, and the great trees formed a natural line of communication between tower and mansion. We descended again into the church proper, where Holmes insisted upon a thorough examination of the tower's base, particularly the north side, where Sir Julius had been found. He measured distances, examined the ground, now frozen hard as iron, and stood for several minutes gazing upward at the louvers far above, as though calculating angles and trajectories. The fall would certainly have been fatal, he concluded. Yet I observe no blood upon the stones immediately surrounding the point of impact, which suggests that Sir Julius died instantly upon striking the ground, without time for his heart to pump blood from the wounds. The skull would have been fractured. Am I correct, Mr. Pritchard? Dr. Carruthers attended, and confirmed as much. The back of the head was— The vicar paused, overcome by the memory. It was not a sight I care to recall. As we returned to the house through the yew tunnel, now fully dark save for the lantern the vicar carried, Holmes walked in silence, his head bowed in thought. Once he stopped and placed his hand upon the trunk of one of the ancient trees, as though testing its solidity. He looked back toward the tower, then forward toward the house, and I saw his lips move as though he were performing some calculation. At the house, we were shown to our rooms, comfortable chambers on the first floor that shared a connecting door and overlooked the terrace and gardens. Holmes immediately began to pace, his pipe sending up clouds of acrid smoke as he processed the data he had gathered. "What do you make of it, Watson?" he asked at length. I considered carefully before responding. The chain and padlock appear genuine, yet someone has been tampering with the bell. The verdigris suggests recent contact. As for Sir Julius's death, if it were murder, the murderer chose his moment well. A fall from such a height would disguise almost any prior injury. Good, Watson. You improve with each case. Now, what of our dramatis personae? Lady Agatha seems genuinely broken by her husband's death, though I confess I find her air of tragedy somewhat theatrical. Mr. Hawksmoor is too eager by half to convince us of his reluctance regarding the inheritance. Mrs. Challis runs a tight household, perhaps too tight. She strikes me as a woman who would resent any disruption to her ordered domain. Mr. Cobb bears watching. There is something of the watchful rat about him. Holmes chuckled. Your instincts serve you well, my dear fellow. I would add only that Hawksmoor's protestations of reluctance regarding the estate ring distinctly false. A man of his evident tastes and expensive habits would find a substantial property most welcome, particularly one that comes with a considerable income from tenant farms and investments. The question before us is this. Granted that someone wishes to drive Miss Ravenscroft from this house before she comes of age, how have they managed to make a chained bell toll 3 times in a manner that has convinced an entire parish of supernatural intervention? Could the chain have been removed, the bell rung, and the chain replaced? An excellent hypothesis, yet it fails upon examination. The padlock shows no signs of having been picked or forced, and a glance at Mr. Pritchard's keyring showed me that he carries only a handful of keys, all of which appeared well worn and specific to their purposes. Moreover, ringing a cracked bell would produce a distinctly unmusical sound, a clatter rather than a toll. Yet all witnesses describe a deep, resonant note that shook the foundations and rattled the windows. No, Watson, the answer lies elsewhere, in some mechanism that has escaped our notice. Before I could respond, a gong sounded below, summoning us to dinner. We descended to find the household assembled in a dining room whose dark panelling seemed to absorb the light of the candles, creating an atmosphere more sepulchral than convivial. The meal was substantial but joyless, accompanied by conversation that remained resolutely trivial, as though by unspoken agreement no one would mention the matter that had brought us to this house. It was only when we had retired once more to the drawing-room that Holmes made his move. "Miss Ravenscroft," he said, "with your permission, I should like to make a thorough examination of the house this evening. I am particularly interested in the library and any rooms that have a clear view toward the church tower." Permission was readily granted, and Holmes set about his investigation with the thoroughness that I had come to expect. He examined the library, a handsome room lined with the accumulated reading of generations, with particular attention to the windows and the skirting boards. In one corner, behind a heavy curtain, he discovered a servant's access that led to a narrow corridor running behind the walls. "These old houses are honeycombed with such passages," he explained, "built for servants to move about, without disturbing the family. They also serve admirably for those who wish to move unseen." He traced this passage to a small lobby behind the library, where he spent several minutes examining the floor and baseboards with his lens. At length he lifted a corner of the carpet runner and exposed a narrow slit in the skirting, perhaps a 1/4 inch wide and 6 inches long. "Mousework," I suggested. Holmes touched his finger to the edge of the slit and held it to his nose. "Mousework, polished smooth and treated with some substance. Rosin, unless I am mistaken. It is used by violinists to treat their bows, Watson, but it has other applications. One might use it to ensure that a cord drawn through such a slit would move smoothly and silently." He would say no more, but insisted that we continue our examination. He contrived, through various pretexts, to view Mr. Hawksmoor's study, a comfortable room adjoining the library, fitted out with a handsome desk, a violin upon its stand, and a view across the yew avenue toward the tower. Holmes examined the walls, the window frames, and even lifted the carpet in several places, though he appeared to find nothing of note. We retired late, and I confess I fell asleep almost at once, exhausted by the journey and the mental exertions of the day. I woke once in the small hours to hear Holmes moving about in his room, and once I could have sworn I heard the faint chime of a tuning fork. But fatigue claimed me again, and I did not fully wake until morning light was creeping through the curtains. Chapter 3. A house. Besieged by echoes. I found Holmes already dressed and breakfasted when I descended the following morning. He had that air of contained excitement that always presaged some breakthrough in his investigations. His eyes were bright, his movements quick and precise, and he consumed his coffee with the air of one fueling a machine for serious work ahead. "Good morning, Watson," he greeted me. "I trust you slept well? I, for my part, have had a most instructive night. I have been conducting certain acoustic experiments which have yielded fascinating results. But first, we must gather more data. I propose that you interview the household staff this morning. They often see and hear things that escape the notice of their betters, while I make certain arrangements regarding the bell tower." After a hasty breakfast, we separated to our respective tasks. I found Alice, the maid who had collapsed, in the servants' hall, where she was half-heartedly polishing silver under Mrs. Chalice's watchful eye. The housekeeper, with obvious reluctance, granted me permission to speak with the girl privately, and I led her to a small sitting room off the main hall. Alice proved eager to unburden herself. She was a pretty girl with fair hair and blue eyes that still showed traces of the terror she had experienced. "Oh, sir," she began, wringing her hands. "It was horrible. Horrible beyond anything. I was crossing the back passage toward the scullery. It would have been about 9 o'clock, for I'd just heard the clock strike in the hall, when the first stroke came. It seemed to come from all around me, sir, not just from the tower, but from the very walls and floor. The air itself seemed to shake with it." "You saw nothing unusual before the sound began?" "Nothing, sir. I had passed through the library corridor not 5 minutes before, and there was no one about. Mr. Hawksmoor was in his study. I could hear him playing his violin. Very soft and sweet it was. Lady Agatha was in the drawing-room with Miss Elinor. Mr. Cobb was in his office, going over the accounts, and Mrs. Chalice was in the kitchen giving instructions for the morning baking." "You are certain of all these positions?" "Yes, sir. I had been sent to fetch something from the still-room, so I'd gone through most of the house. It was after I'd fetched what Mrs. Chalice wanted, and was returning that the bell sounded. And the strokes, how were they spaced? Perhaps half a minute between each one, sir. Long enough that after the first, I thought perhaps I'd imagined it. But then the second came, and then the third, and I don't remember anything after that until I woke up in my room with Dr. Carruthers bending over me." I questioned her further about the night of Sir Julius's death, but she could add little to what we already knew. She had been abed by the time the tragedy occurred, though she remembered being wakened by the commotion when the body was discovered. From Alice I proceeded to interview Mrs. Chalice, whom I found in her sitting-room reviewing household accounts. She was less forthcoming than the maid, viewing my questions with suspicion barely concealed beneath a veneer of proper deference. "The house is in good order, Doctor," she informed me stiffly. "Whatever these disturbances may be, they are no reflection upon the management of the domestic arrangements. I run a tight household, and always have." "No one suggests otherwise, Mrs. Chalice. I am merely trying to establish the exact sequence of events. You were in the kitchen when the bell tolled?" "I was. I heard it as clearly as anyone, and I'll not deny it gave me a turn. But I don't hold with supernatural explanations. There'll be some natural cause, mark my words, though what it might be I cannot say. As for Sir Julius's death, it was a tragedy, and no more. He was always one to take risks, climbing about the estate without a care for his own safety." "You thought highly of Sir Julius?" Her expression softened slightly. "He was a good master, Doctor. Fair in his dealings, which is more than can be said for some. The household ran smoothly under his direction. I found Mr. Cobb in his estate office, a small room lined with ledgers and account books, smelling strongly of lamp oil and leather. He was a man who weighed his words as carefully as he evidently weighed his columns of figures, and I had the distinct impression that he resented the intrusion upon his time. I keep the accounts, Doctor, and see to the running of the estate's business affairs. What the house's inhabitants choose to do with their time is no concern of mine, provided they pay their bills promptly." He fixed me with a shrewd look. "As for this Bell business, I'll reserve judgment until Mr. Holmes has concluded his investigation. I'm a practical man, sir, and I deal in facts and figures, not in superstitions and servants' tales. Yet you yourself heard the bell?" I did, and I'll not deny it was a queer experience. But I'll wait for a proper explanation before I start believing in hauntings. I pressed him regarding the estate's finances, but he remained tight-lipped, saying only that the property was adequately provided for, and that Miss Ravenscroft would inherit a comfortable competence upon coming of age. When I asked about Sir Julius's death, his face darkened. An accident, Doctor, and nothing more. Sir Julius was examining the tower structure. He'd been concerned about the stability of the bell frame for some time. He leaned out too far and lost his balance. A tragedy, yes, but not a mystery. Meanwhile, Holmes had not been idle. He had enlisted the help of Mr. Pritchard and the church sexton, an ancient man named Sims, in conducting what he described as certain experiments of an acoustic nature in the bell tower. When we reunited at luncheon, he was in excellent spirits, though he refused to share the results of his morning's work beyond saying that they had been most illuminating. That afternoon, at Holmes's request, Miss Elinor joined us for a walk upon the terrace. It was another day of bitter cold, with ice crusting the balustrades and the yews standing black against a sky the colour of pewter. Holmes questioned her closely about the terms of Sir Julius's will. "The estate is held in trust until I reach my 25th birthday," she explained, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Until that time, I must remain in residence at Ravenscroft House or forfeit my inheritance entirely. Should I fail to meet this condition, or should I die before reaching my majority, the entire property passes to Mr. Hawksmoor as next of kin. Sir Julius established a jointure for Lady Agatha, of course, and she has the right to remain in the dower house for her lifetime. The household staff are provided for with pensions. And the value of the estate. Mr. Cobb estimates the annual income at approximately £4,000, with capital assets of perhaps £80,000. Not a great fortune by London standards, Mr. Holmes, but sufficient to maintain the house and provide a comfortable independence. And Mr. Hawksmoor's financial situation. A delicate flush coloured her pale cheeks. I should not speak of a kinsman's difficulties, but as they bear upon the matter at hand, yes, Mr. Hawksmoor is in straitened circumstances. He had chambers in London and moved in musical circles that were, I gather, somewhat beyond his means. There were debts. Sir Julius offered him refuge here last spring, but made it clear that no direct financial assistance would be forthcoming. My guardian believed that adversity built character. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. And since taking up residence here, Mr. Hawksmoor has urged you to relinquish the property. Not in so many words at first. He would mention the burden of maintaining such an establishment, the loneliness of my position, the advantages of a smaller residence in town, where I might have society and amusement. But since Sir Julius's death, and particularly since last night's manifestation, he has become more insistent. He speaks of the house as though it were a malevolent entity, determined to drive away all who would possess it. "Tell me," Holmes said, pausing to gaze across at the church tower, "on the night of Sir Julius's death, do you recall any unusual circumstances, any visitor to the house, any alteration in routine?" Miss Elinor considered this carefully. The day had been unremarkable. Sir Julius spent the morning with Mr. Cobb reviewing estate matters, took luncheon with us, and spent the afternoon in his study, attending to correspondence. After dinner, Mr. Hawksmoor played for us. He has considerable skill upon the violin. Around 8 o'clock, Sir Julius announced his intention to inspect the tower, saying that Mr. Cobb had reported some concern about the timbers. We thought nothing of it. He often made such inspections. He went alone. Yes, he took a lantern and said he would be back within the hour. When midnight came, and he had not returned, we sent Simmons to look for him. He found— Her voice broke slightly. He found Sir Julius at the base of the north wall. Dr. Carruthers said death would have been instantaneous. Holmes laid a gentle hand upon her arm. You have borne this burden with remarkable fortitude, Miss Ravenscroft. Have courage a little longer. I believe we shall have answers soon. As twilight gathered, transforming the landscape into a study of purple shadows and grey mist, Holmes announced his intention of taking a solitary walk. He was gone for above an hour, and when he returned, his boots were muddy, and his greatcoat sparkled with frost crystals. He carried with him a length of what appeared to be catgut cord, which he examined by candlelight with evident satisfaction. "Watson," he said, "I believe we shall have a performance tonight. Our phantom bell ringer cannot resist the opportunity to terrify the household once more. But this time we shall be waiting." He spent the remainder of the evening in peculiar preparations. From his travelling case he produced a quantity of lampblack and a small pot of Paris plaster, which he mixed to form a paste. This he applied carefully to that slit in the library skirting, and then dusted the floor beneath the window with a fine coat of the plaster. He also ran a silk thread of his own from a tack in the panelling to a point near the window, arranging it so that it would be disturbed by anyone passing through the room. In the bell tower, he informed me, he had made similar preparations. With Mr. Pritchard's assistance, he had loosened the chain that secured the clapper, but only slightly, not enough to be visible to casual inspection. He had then suspended within the bell a secondary clapper of his own devising. A weight of lead wrapped in soft leather, attached to a length of catgut that ran from inside the bell, around a roof beam, and out through the louvers to the exterior. The principle is simplicity itself, he explained. A cracked bell will not ring true if struck in the normal fashion, but if one can cause a soft implement to kiss the crack at precisely the right point, the bell will resonate with a deep, haunting tone. The crack itself acts as a sort of amplifier, and the peculiar acoustics of the tower and the yew avenue create a resonance chamber that carries the sound directly to the house. But how is the line operated? Ah, Watson, that is the question I have been endeavouring to answer. I believe I have found the mechanism, a small brass wheel, cunningly concealed, which allows our performer to pull the line while remaining comfortably indoors. The rosin upon the wood serves to provide grip without squeaking. Tonight I have doctored both the wheel and the line with our lamp-black mixture. Any hand that touches either will carry away an unmistakable mark. As darkness fell, Holmes arranged for the household to gather in the great hall. He had contrived, through Miss Elinor, to call a family conference regarding certain matters of estate management that required the presence of all parties. Lady Agatha was installed upon a settee near the fire, her handkerchief clutched in one pale hand. Mr. Hawksmoor paced before the windows with theatrical agitation, occasionally pressing a hand to his brow as though oppressed by heavy thoughts. Mr. Cobb stood near the doorway, his face expressionless. The servants had been given the evening free, save for Mrs. Chalice, who remained in the kitchen. Holmes had positioned me behind a Japanese screen near the door to the library, with instructions to observe anyone who left the hall. He himself had disappeared upstairs, claiming a need to retrieve certain documents from his room. We waited in a silence, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the measured tick of the long case clock in the corner. Lady Agatha's handkerchief moved constantly to her eyes, though I saw no tears. Mr. Hawksmoor's pacing grew more agitated. Miss Elinor sat with admirable composure, her hands folded in her lap, though I could see the tension in her shoulders. Then it came, that deep, resonant thrumming that seemed to rise from the very earth. The first stroke rolled across the frozen landscape like distant thunder, setting the window panes to vibrating and causing Lady Agatha to cry out. Before its echoes had fully died, a figure detached itself from the group and moved swiftly toward the library. A shadow among shadows, silent as smoke. I pressed myself against the screen, hardly daring to breathe, as Mr. Lionel Hawksmoor passed within 3 feet of my hiding place. His face, caught for an instant in the firelight from the hall, wore an expression of intense concentration. He moved through the library with the confidence of one who knows his way in the dark, pausing only at the far end of the room, where a door led to his study. The second stroke sounded, deeper, if anything, than the first, and I heard from the hall the confused exclamations of those who remained. Hawksmoor had vanished into his study now, and I crept forward until I could see through the partially open door. By the light of a single candle that burned upon the desk, I saw him kneel beside the wall near the window. His elegant fingers worked at something I could not quite make out. A small brass wheel set into the baseboard, barely visible even when one knew where to look. He pulled, and I saw the gleam of a cord running through the slit in the skirting. His hand moved in a steady rhythm, and the tension in his shoulders spoke of considerable physical effort. Before I could react, Holmes's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Once is an omen, Mr. Hawksmoor. Twice is an experiment. Thrice is a conviction." Hawksmoor spun toward us, for Holmes had materialized in the doorway beside me, and I saw his face in the candlelight. It was a ghastly sight, for the lamp-black had transferred itself to his fingers, and from there to his face, leaving grey smears across his forehead and cheek, where he had evidently wiped away perspiration. His right hand, still gripping the catgut line, was stained black to the wrist. For a moment I thought he might attempt to flee, but the fight seemed to drain from him all at once. He looked down at his betraying hand, then back at Holmes, and a strange smile twisted his lips. "You are very clever, Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice remarkably steady despite the circumstances. "Pray tell your audience how I managed to make a chained bell toll across the countryside." Holmes stepped fully into the room, and I followed. The principle is ingenious, I grant you, though the execution was betrayed by certain small details that accumulated to form a damning picture. You did not make the chained bell ring. That would have been impossible, as you well knew. Instead, you created a secondary mechanism, a false clapper of soft leather that could be made to strike the cracked bell at precisely the point where it would produce a deep, resonant tone. The crack itself, which rendered the bell useless for normal ringing, became your ally, for it created that peculiar hollow quality that so terrorized your audience. Holmes crossed to the window and pointed out toward the tower, now barely visible in the darkness. You ran a line of catgut, the same material used for violin strings, and with which you were intimately familiar, from your hidden clapper, round a beam in the bell tower, out through the louvers, along the tops of the yew trees, and down to this room, where you passed it through a slit in the skirting and attached it to this brass wheel. The wheel gave you mechanical advantage, allowing you to pull the line with sufficient force to make the clapper strike the bell. The rosin ensured that your hand would not slip upon the line, and the same rosin upon the slit prevented any telltale squeaking. The yew trees served as a natural conduit for the sound, channeling it directly toward the house and creating the impression that the entire landscape was resonating. He pinched the catgut line between his fingers, and from the tower came a faint answering note, the third stroke we had been waiting for. The effect was eerily perfect, and I confess my flesh crawled despite knowing the mechanism. The chain and padlock upon the true clapper, Holmes continued, were your misdirection. You encouraged everyone to believe that they were examining the only possible means of ringing the bell, when in fact they were examining an irrelevant detail. Your hidden clapper required no key, no forced locks, no supernatural intervention, merely a steady hand and sufficient strength to pull a weighted cord. Hawksmoor had sunk into a chair, his stained hands lying palm up upon his knees like some grotesque stigmata. "And Sir Julius?" he asked quietly. Holmes's expression grew stern. "Sir Julius died because he discovered your mechanism, did he not? On the night of his death, you made a trial of your device. That single muffled stroke that old Burdock heard. But Sir Julius also heard it, and being a man of inquiring mind, he went to investigate. Perhaps you met him at the tower by arrangement, claiming you wished to show him something. Perhaps you engineered an excuse to lure him up the stairs. However it occurred, you found an opportunity to push him from the parapet, knowing that the fall would disguise any struggle. You hoped the death would be ruled an accident, as indeed it was, and that the estate would pass to Miss Ravenscroft under the terms of the will. But the will required her to remain in residence, I interjected. Precisely, Watson. And here was the brilliance of Hawksmoor's scheme. He would use the legend of the tolling bell to drive her from the house before she reached her majority. 3 strokes, the traditional warning of death. What young woman could withstand such supernatural persecution? If she fled Ravenscroft House, she would forfeit the inheritance. If she remained and could be driven to some fatal accident, well, that would serve equally well. Either way, the estate would pass to Hawksmoor as next of kin. Holmes turned back to our captive. You betrayed yourself in numerous small ways, Mr. Hawksmoor. The verdigris upon your cuffs transferred from the bell's bronze when you installed your mechanism, the rosin upon your desk, and the spool of catgut upon your violin stand, though you claimed to use only horsehair for your bow, the recent carpentry in your study, which you attributed to repairing a draught, but which actually concealed the installation of your wheel and pulley system, the receipt from Withycombe, ironmongery for brass fittings, made out to Mr. Lane, but witnessed as delivered to this address. And finally, the lamp-black and plaster I applied this evening, which have marked you as clearly as Cain. He walked to the window and gazed out at the tower. It was an ingenious scheme, requiring considerable technical knowledge and no small amount of nerve. Had you been content with a single manifestation, you might have succeeded. But you could not resist the theatrical gesture, the 3 strokes that would complete the legend. And it was that very theatricality that brought you down. The door burst open then, and Miss Elinor entered with Mr. Pritchard and several others of the household. They stopped short at the sight that met their eyes. Hawksmoor slumped in his chair, his face marked with damning grey smears, his hands black with lampblack, and beside him Holmes, holding the catgut line, like a judge holding the evidence of guilt. "You have your bell ringer, Miss Ravenscroft," Holmes said quietly. "He rang not from the tower, but from this room, using a mechanism as clever as it was cruel. He sought to drive you from your inheritance through terror, and when that seemed insufficient, he would have arranged some fatal accident to achieve the same end. He has already one death upon his conscience, that of Sir Julius, whom he pushed from the tower when your guardian discovered his device." Miss Elinor's face had gone white. "Uncle Julius, murdered. But the coroner saw what Hawksmoor intended him to see. A tragic accident. But I believe a more thorough examination will reveal certain inconsistencies. Dr. Carruthers noted that the wound was to the back of the head, yet a man falling face first from a height would more likely injure the front of the skull. I suspect we shall find that Sir Julius was struck from behind before he fell, though the impact of the fall rendered the prior injury indistinguishable." Hawksmoor raised his head, and I was struck by the look of weary resignation upon his features. "He was going to change the will," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He told me that very afternoon. He said he'd been too generous, that Elinor needed a stronger guardian, someone who would prevent fortune hunters from pursuing her. He was going to alter the terms so that the estate would pass to trustees if anything happened to him. I would have received nothing, not a penny after all these months of exile in this provincial backwater, listening to him prose on about economy and character and responsibility." His voice gained strength as he spoke, and I detected in it now a bitter resentment that he had evidently been nursing for months. I followed him to the tower that night. I said I had noticed something wrong with the bell frame during my walks. He was always receptive to such practical concerns. We climbed together to the ringing chamber, and I showed him where I had installed my mechanism. I was rather proud of it, you know. I thought he might appreciate the ingenuity. But he was furious. He said it was a contemptible trick, that I was trying to frighten Elinor from her inheritance. He turned to go down and fetch the constable. And I could not let him do that. He fell silent, and in that silence we could all hear the admission of guilt as clearly as if he had shouted it. The man had murdered his benefactor, the uncle who had given him shelter, and then attempted to terrorize a young woman into abandoning her rightful inheritance. All for money, that most ancient and most sordid of motives. Chapter 4. The device in the wall and the net in the yew. The remainder of that evening passed in a blur of activity. Mr. Pritchard, with admirable presence of mind, had sent word to the local constabulary, and within the hour Sergeant Willett arrived from Withycombe, a solid, no-nonsense man who listened to Holmes's explanation with a mixture of rustic scepticism and professional respect for evidence. Holmes took him through the entire sequence of deduction, from the initial observation of the verdigris to the final trap with the lamp-black, and even produced the receipts and physical evidence that proved Hawksmoor's guilt beyond reasonable doubt. Hawksmoor himself had lapsed into a state of peculiar calm, as though the unmasking of his crime had lifted some terrible burden from his shoulders. He made no attempt to deny the charges, though he did request pen and paper to write what he called a proper account of his actions. This the sergeant permitted, and Hawksmoor retired to compose his confession while constables stood guard. The household, meanwhile, had fallen into that strange mixture of relief and horror that accompanies the revelation of guilt in one's midst. Lady Agatha had retreated to her rooms, attended by Mrs. Chalice. Miss Elinor displayed remarkable fortitude, though I could see the shock and grief warring in her pale face. She asked Holmes to explain the mechanism once more, as though understanding its physical operation might somehow make the betrayal less painful. Holmes obliged, and indeed seemed eager to elaborate upon the technical details. The fundamental principle, he explained, is that a cracked bell produces different tones depending upon where and how it is struck. Your villain discovered, whether through experiment or intuition, that a soft blow delivered to the crack itself would cause the entire bell to resonate with a deep, haunting note, quite unlike its normal peal. The leather rapping upon his hidden clapper ensured that the blow was soft enough not to sound like hammering, yet firm enough to set the bronze vibrating. He sketched the arrangement upon a piece of paper. The catgut line ran from the leather clapper inside the bell, around a roof beam, which served as a pulley, and out through the louvers. From there, it was strung along the tops of the yew trees. You may have noticed that these trees have been trained over the centuries into fantastic shapes. Their upper branches actually touch in places, forming a natural trellis. The line could be run along these branches with minimal visibility from the ground, especially at night. But surely the line would be seen during daylight, Miss Elinor objected. Catgut, when properly selected, is nearly invisible at any distance beyond a few feet, particularly when strung against a background of dark branches. Moreover, Hawksmoor took the precaution of using gut that had been stained dark brown to match the wood. I found traces of walnut stain upon the wheel in his study. Holmes indicated another point on his diagram. The line descended from the yews near the house and was brought in through a small gap between the window frame and the sill, a gap that Hawksmoor had carefully enlarged during his repairs to eliminate drafts. From the window, it passed behind the panelling through that slit we discovered, emerging near the wheel that gave him the mechanical advantage necessary to pull the line taut. The beauty of the arrangement was that he could operate it from the comfort of his study, with the door closed and a candle burning, presenting every appearance of innocent occupation. The rosen, I added, proud to contribute to the explanation, prevented his hand from slipping during the operation. Exactly, Watson. And it had the additional advantage of being readily explainable if discovered. A violinist naturally has rosen in his possession. Indeed, every element of his mechanism could be individually explained as innocent: catgut for violin strings, brass fittings for minor household repairs, rosen for his bow. It was only when assembled into a complete picture that their sinister purpose became clear. Mr. Pritchard, who had been listening intently, now spoke. But, Mr. Holmes, the manifestations seemed to shake the very walls. How could a line pulled from such a distance produce such power? An excellent question, Vicar. The answer lies in the combined effect of several factors. First, the bell itself is very large. I estimate it weighs nearly a ton. And even a cracked bell of such size will produce considerable volume when properly struck. Second, the crack creates a peculiar resonance, almost like an organ pipe that amplifies certain frequencies. Third, the tower acts as a resonating chamber, channeling the sound outward through the louvers. And finally, this is perhaps the most crucial element, the yew avenue creates a natural acoustic corridor, almost like a speaking tube that directs the sound toward the house with unusual force. He paused, then added, I verified this last point through experiment this afternoon. With Mr. Simms's assistance, I suspended various weights inside the bell and struck them against different points on the interior. The effect was remarkable. Sounds that seemed quite modest when standing beside the tower arrived at the house with startling power, as though the very air between tower and mansion conspired to carry the tone. It seems almost supernatural, Miss Elinor murmured. On the contrary, Miss Ravenscroft, it is entirely natural, which is precisely what made it so effective. Hawksmoor understood that the most convincing supernatural manifestation is one that employs natural means. He did not need to convince you that ghosts existed. He needed only to convince you that the bell was ringing and that ancient family legends provided the explanation. Once that conviction was established, fear did the rest. Sergeant Willett emerged then from the library, carrying Hawksmoor's written confession. He's been quite thorough, Mr. Holmes, the sergeant said, his country accent thick with disapproval. Admits to the murder of Sir Julius, admits to the attempted intimidation of Miss Ravenscroft, even provides details of how he installed his contraption over the course of several weeks. Says he worked mostly at night, claiming he was taking walks for his health. His health, Holmes repeated dryly. Yes, I imagine his financial health was much on his mind. May I see the document? He read through Hawksmoor's confession with close attention, occasionally nodding or making small sounds of acknowledgement. When he had finished, he handed it back to the sergeant. It is comprehensive, and, I believe, accurate. You will note that he claims Sir Julius discovered the mechanism by accident, that Sir Julius had gone to the tower, not by arrangement, but on his own initiative, and confronted Hawksmoor when the latter arrived to adjust his device. Whether this is true, or whether Hawksmoor lured his victim to the tower by some pretext, I cannot say with certainty. Either way, the murder was deliberate, and the subsequent attempts to drive Miss Ravenscroft from her home were carefully calculated. He'll hang for it, Willett said bluntly. Begging your pardon, miss, but there's no other outcome when a man murders his benefactor for gain. Miss Elinor turned away, and I saw her shoulders shake with suppressed emotion. Holmes, with uncharacteristic gentleness, laid a hand upon her arm. Justice must be served, Miss Ravenscroft, but you need not witness its mechanisms. You have been both brave and patient throughout this ordeal. Now you must think of the future, of this house and estate that are truly yours, free from the shadow of threat. We remained at Ravenscroft House for 2 more days while the legal formalities were completed and Hawksmoor was transported to the county jail to await trial. Holmes spent much of this time in dismantling the bell mechanism, working with Mr. Pritchard and the sexton to remove the leather clapper, secure the louvers against any future tampering, and, at Miss Elinor's request, to repair the crack in the bell itself. It can be done, the vicar explained, as we stood in the ringing chamber, watching a metalworker examine the damage. Though the bell will never ring true again. The bronze has been too deeply compromised. Still, we might restore it to a state where it could be rung without danger, even if the tone remains imperfect. "Let it remain imperfect," Miss Elinor said quietly. She had accompanied us to the tower, determined to face the place where her guardian had died. "Let it serve as a memorial to those who have died, and a reminder that even broken things may still have purpose." Holmes nodded approvingly. "A philosophic sentiment, Miss Ravenscroft, and one that does you credit." On our final evening at Ravenscroft House, the household gathered for a dinner that bore little resemblance to the grim meal we had shared upon our arrival. Lady Agatha had emerged from her rooms with something approaching animation in her features, as though the resolution of the mystery had freed her from some paralysis of grief. Mr. Cobb was almost jovial, relieved perhaps that the estate's future was now secure. Even the servants seemed lighter of spirit, and I heard laughter from the kitchen, a sound that Mrs. Challis would have suppressed a few days earlier. Miss Elinor raised her glass in a toast. "To Mr. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson, who have given me back my home and my peace. I can never adequately express my gratitude." "Your gratitude is in your courage, Miss Ravenscroft," Holmes replied. "You did not flee when terror was the intended response. You sought understanding rather than accepting superstition. These qualities will serve you well in your stewardship of this estate." Later, as Holmes and I stood in the library, now restored to its proper function as a place of learning rather than a corridor for murder, he permitted himself one of his rare moments of reflection. "It is a melancholy case, Watson. A man of intelligence and talent, driven by debt and disappointment to betray every principle of honour. Had Hawksmoor applied his ingenuity to honest endeavour, he might have achieved genuine success. Instead, he chose the path of deception and violence, and in the end was betrayed by the very cleverness upon which he prided himself." "The lamp-black trap was masterful," I observed. Holmes waved away the compliment. "A simple trick, and one that any competent investigator might have employed. No, Watson, the true key to this case lay not in any single piece of evidence, but in the accumulation of small observations. The verdigris, the rozon, the fresh carpentry, the spool of catgut, the peculiar acoustic properties of the yew avenue, each was insignificant alone, but together they formed an unmistakable pattern. That is the essence of detection, to see not merely the individual trees, but the shape of the forest they comprise. And what of the legend of the bell? Was there any truth to it?" Holmes smiled. "Legends, my dear fellow, are true in a sense that has little to do with facts. The bell tolled before Sir Edmund's execution. Perhaps someone remembered it that way after the event. The human mind is remarkably skilled at finding patterns where none exist. But I will say this. Had the bell truly possessed supernatural power, it would not have required Hawksmoor's mechanism to make it ring. When a bell tolls for the living, Watson—" But he broke off there, perhaps feeling he had waxed too philosophical for one evening. We finished our inspection of the library and retired to our rooms, where I found myself unable to sleep despite the day's exertions. From my window I could see the church tower, black against the stars, its bell now forever silent save for whatever legitimate ringers might in future be licensed to waken it. And I reflected that in solving the mystery of the tolling bell, Holmes had done more than expose a murderer. He had freed an entire parish from the tyranny of fear, and restored to a young woman her rightful inheritance and peace of mind. Chapter 5. The Peal Unmasked. We departed Ravenscroft House on a morning of exceptional clarity, the kind of winter day when the air seems to sharpen every outline and render distances deceptive. Miss Elinor accompanied us to the station in the trap, determined to see us off personally, despite our protests that such courtesy was unnecessary. "You have given me more than a solution to a mystery, Mr. Holmes," she said, as we waited for the London train. "You have given me the courage to face my future without fear. The house no longer seems oppressive. The legends no longer hold power. For that, I shall be eternally grateful." "Use your inheritance wisely, Miss Ravenscroft," Holmes replied. "Ravenscroft House has weathered many storms. Under your stewardship, I believe it will weather many more." The train arrived in a cloud of steam and clamour, and we boarded to begin our return journey to Baker Street. As the Sussex countryside rolled past our window, fields white with frost, villages huddled against the cold, church towers rising like stone prayers against the winter sky, I found myself reviewing the case in my mind, assembling it into the narrative that would eventually find its way into my notes. Holmes, as was his custom after the successful conclusion of a case, had lapsed into a contemplative silence, his pipe filling our compartment with aromatic smoke. I knew better than to disturb him at such moments, yet after we had travelled some miles, he spoke without prompting. "You will write this up, I suppose, Watson?" "With your permission. It seems to me a case worthy of record. The ingenuity of the mechanism, the psychological insight into the power of fear, the accumulation of small evidences into an inescapable conclusion. Do not make me too clever, my dear fellow. I was slow to perceive the full scope of Hawksmoor's scheme. Had I been quicker, Sir Julius might still be alive." This uncharacteristic self-criticism surprised me. "You cannot blame yourself for failing to prevent a murder of which you had no knowledge until after the fact." "Perhaps not. Yet I cannot shake the feeling that had I been more attuned to the psychological dimension of the case from the beginning, I might have anticipated Hawksmoor's next move. The 3 strokes were inevitable, given his theatrical nature and his need to create maximum terror. I should have set my trap after the first manifestation, rather than waiting for the second." "And risked exposing your hand before you had sufficient evidence." He smiled slightly. "You argue like a lawyer, Watson. Very well, I concede the point. One must work with the information available, not with the information one wishes one had possessed." We fell silent again, and I watched the landscape transform gradually from rural to suburban as we approached the great sprawl of London. The factories began to appear, then the endless rows of terraced houses, then the smoke and noise that announced our return to civilization. It was not until we had regained our rooms in Baker Street, and Mrs. Hudson had brought us tea and a cold supper, that Holmes spoke again of the case. "There is a lesson in this affair, Watson, that extends beyond the particulars of murder and mechanism. Hawksmoor's genius, for it was a species of genius, albeit twisted to evil purpose, lay in his understanding of human psychology. He recognized that people wish to believe in the extraordinary, that they will accept a supernatural explanation more readily than they will search for a natural one, particularly when the supernatural explanation aligns with existing legend and tradition. He exploited superstition. He created it, or rather, he revived and weaponized an existing superstition. The legend of the tolling bell was known to the household, but had lain dormant for generations. Hawksmoor brought it back to life, made it immediate and threatening, and in so doing created an atmosphere in which rational thought became difficult. Once people believe they are dealing with the supernatural, they cease to look for natural explanations. The chain and padlock became proof of impossibility rather than clues to an alternative mechanism. I pondered this as I poured our tea. Yet Miss Ravenscroft consulted you rather than fleeing, which suggests she retained some measure of rational thought despite her fear. True, and that is what saved her. She was afraid, yes, but she channeled her fear into action rather than on paralysis. She sought understanding rather than accepting defeat. It is a pattern I have observed often. Those who face their fears directly are far more likely to survive them than those who succumb to panic. He sipped his tea and continued. You asked earlier about the legend of the bell, whether there was any truth to it. I have been thinking about that question. Legends often contain a kernel of historical fact, embellished over time until the fact becomes indistinguishable from fiction. Did the bell of St. Mark's toll before various family tragedies? Perhaps it did, though not through supernatural agency. It is equally possible that the bell tolled for other reasons: weather conditions, structural stress, even pranksters, and was later associated with tragedies that occurred around the same time. The human mind seeks causation, Watson, and will find it even where none exists. So, the legend was entirely coincidence or entirely manufactured. Consider, if one wishes to establish a family legend of supernatural warning, one need only wait for a tragedy to occur, as tragedies inevitably do in the course of generations, and then claim retroactively that a bell tolled beforehand. Once the pattern is established, it becomes self-reinforcing. People remember the hits and forget the misses, as the gamblers say. This cynical view of human credulity was characteristic of Holmes, yet I could not entirely accept it. But surely some legends have foundation in genuine mystery. Oh, undoubtedly. The world is full of genuine mysteries, Watson. Phenomena we do not yet understand, events that defy current explanation. But in my experience, 99 mysteries out of 100 yield to rational investigation. And the 100th, well, perhaps that one is genuinely supernatural, or perhaps we simply lack sufficient data to explain it. Either way, I prefer to investigate on the assumption that natural law prevails until proven otherwise. He rose and walked to the window, looking out over Baker Street where the evening traffic was thinning. Hawksmoor's error, beyond the obvious moral enormity of his actions, was one of excessive complexity. He could not resist the theatrical gesture, the dramatic third stroke that would complete the legendary pattern. Had he contented himself with a single manifestation, enough to unsettle Miss Ravenscroft, but not enough to prompt immediate investigation, he might have succeeded in gradually undermining her resolve to remain at Ravenscroft House. But he wanted the full performance, the complete legend brought to life, and in satisfying his theatrical instincts, he created the very circumstances that allowed me to detect his mechanism. "Pride goeth before a fall," I murmured. Indeed, and in this case, pride led not merely to a fall, but to the gallows. Hawksmoor will hang for his crime, and rightly so. He murdered a man who had shown him nothing but kindness and attempted to terrorize an innocent woman into abandoning her inheritance. These are not offenses that society can forgive. The fire crackled in the grate, and outside the fog was beginning to roll in from the river, transforming Baker Street into a scene from some phantasmagoric painting. Holmes turned from the window and settled into his chair with that air of satisfaction that always marked the successful conclusion of a case. "You know, Watson, there is something almost admirable in the sheer audacity of Hawksmoor's scheme. To rig a church bell in such a manner, to operate it from a distance, to create an acoustic effect that would convince an entire parish of supernatural intervention. It required not only technical skill, but also a deep understanding of human nature and the physics of sound. In another life, with his talents directed toward honest endeavor, Hawksmoor might have been an inventor of note, perhaps even a composer of distinction. His violin playing, I am told, was of professional quality. Yet he chose instead to become a murderer. Yes, and therein lies the eternal tragedy of the criminal mind. Intelligence without conscience, skill without scruple, ambition without honor. These combinations invariably lead to destruction, both of others and ultimately of the self. Hawksmoor had every advantage: education, breeding, talent, opportunity. He squandered all of it through inability to master his appetites and his unwillingness to accept the consequences of his own poor choices. Thought of the elegant, melancholy figure we had first met in the drawing-room at Ravenscroft House, and tried to reconcile that image with the desperate murderer who had pushed his benefactor from a tower and then attempted to drive a young woman to ruin through calculated terror. The transformation seemed scarcely credible, yet I knew from long experience with Holmes that the criminal mind often wore the most civilized of masks. "What will become of the household?" I asked. "Will Miss Ravenscroft be able to maintain the estate without Sir Julius's guidance?" "I believe so. She has shown herself to be a woman of considerable strength and practical intelligence. Mr. Cobb, whatever his other faults may be, is a competent steward, and with Hawksmoor gone, there will be no one to undermine her authority. Lady Agatha may remain in the Dower House if she chooses, or she may prefer to remove to some smaller establishment where she can indulge her melancholy without casting a pall over the entire household. Either way, I fancy Ravenscroft House will flourish under Miss Elinor's direction." "And the bell?" "Ah, yes, the bell. I advised Mr. Pritchard to leave it cracked, as Miss Ravenscroft suggested. It will serve as a memorial and a reminder, not of supernatural forces, but of human fallibility and the danger of allowing superstition to triumph over reason. Perhaps in time, when the memory of these events has faded, they may have it recast or replaced. But for now, let it stand as it is. Broken but not defeated. Silent but not forgotten." He fell silent for a moment, then added with that dry humor that was characteristic of him, "Besides, I have developed a certain fondness for that bell. It presented me with one of the more intriguing acoustic puzzles I have encountered. The fact that Hawksmoor used it for evil purposes does not diminish the elegance of the mechanism itself. In a purely technical sense, it was a masterpiece of applied physics and engineering. Holmes, you cannot admire the device while condemning its creator." "Can I not? I assure you, Watson, I can and do. The human capacity for creation is morally neutral. It is the use to which we put our creations that determines their ethical value. A knife may cut bread or cut throats. The knife itself bears no moral burden. Similarly, Hawksmoor's bell mechanism was neither good nor evil. It was simply clever. The evil lay in his application of that cleverness to murder and intimidation. This sophistry seemed to me dangerously close to moral relativism, and I was about to say so when Mrs. Hudson knocked and entered with the evening post. Among the usual collection of correspondence was a telegram, which Holmes opened with his paper knife and read with evident satisfaction. "From Sergeant Willett," he announced. "Hawksmoor has made a full confession before the magistrate and has been committed for trial at the next assizes. The case is complete, Watson. Justice will be served. Will you attend the trial?" "I think not. My testimony has been taken by deposition, and that should suffice. I have no desire to watch a man hang, even one who so richly deserves his fate. The satisfaction in these cases lies in the solving of the puzzle and the prevention of further harm, not in witnessing the execution of sentence." He rose and walked to his desk, where he withdrew a notebook and began to write rapidly. I recognized this as his method of filing away the details of a case while they were still fresh in his mind, and I left him to his work while I settled down with the evening papers. The case of the Bell of Ravenscroft would soon be behind us, relegated to the archives of Holmes's career, one more entry in that long catalogue of crimes solved and mysteries unravelled. Yet as I sat there in the comfortable warmth of our sitting-room, listening to the scratch of Holmes's pen and the occasional rumble of a cab in the street below, I found my thoughts returning again and again to that frozen Sussex countryside, to the dark tower with its cracked bell, and to the yew avenue that had served as conduit for both sound and treachery. There was something about the case that remained with me, not the mechanism itself, ingenious though it was, but rather the underlying theme of fear, deliberately cultivated and exploited for gain. Hawksmoor had understood, perhaps better than most men, that fear is the most powerful of human emotions, capable of overriding reason and good sense. He had weaponized that understanding, turning ancient legend into modern terror, and in so doing had nearly destroyed an innocent woman's life. That he had ultimately been caught and punished was a testament to Holmes's genius for observation and deduction, but also to Miss Ravenscroft's courage in seeking help rather than succumbing to panic. "Holmes," I said, breaking the silence, "do you believe we have heard the last of the Bell of Ravenscroft? Might not the legend persist, despite your having exposed the mechanism?" He looked up from his writing, his eyes thoughtful. "An interesting question, Watson. I suspect the legend will indeed persist, though perhaps in altered form. People enjoy a good ghost story, and the truth that a murderer rigged a bell to terrorize his victim is perhaps less satisfying to the imagination than the notion of supernatural forces at work. I should not be surprised to learn, 20 years hence, that the Bell of Ravenscroft is still said to toll before a death, and that my investigation is remembered as merely one skeptic's attempt to rationalize the inexplicable. That seems unjust. Justice and truth are not always the same thing, my dear fellow. I content myself with having served the cause of the latter. As for the former, that must be left to judges and juries and the court of public opinion. If the legend brings comfort or interest to the parish of Withycombe, who am I to insist on robbing them of their supernatural heritage? The important thing is that Miss Ravenscroft knows the truth and can live free from fear in her own home. He returned to his writing, and I to my paper, and the evening wore on in companionable silence. It was only much later, as I was preparing to retire, that Holmes spoke one final time on the subject of the case. "Watson," he said, looking up from his completed notes, When you write this up for your chronicle, as I know you shall, remember to include one particular observation." "What is that?" His eyes gleamed with that mixture of humour and wisdom that I had come to recognize as the essential Holmes. "When a bell tolls for the living, my dear Watson, you may be sure a rogue has found the rope." I committed this aphorism to memory, recognizing it as the perfect summary of the entire affair. A bell that could not ring had been made to toll through human agency, not supernatural intervention. Fear had been manufactured, legend had been exploited, and murder had been committed, all in service of greed and ambition. Yet in the end, the mechanisms of crime had been exposed, the rogue had been caught, and justice had been served. As I climbed the stairs to my bedroom that night, I reflected that this case, like so many others in which I had assisted my remarkable friend, demonstrated the fundamental truth of Holmes's philosophy. That the world, for all its mysteries and shadows, operates according to natural law. That human evil, however cunningly disguised, leaves traces that can be detected and followed. And that reason, carefully applied, is more than a match for even the most elaborate schemes of the criminal mind. The Bell of Ravenscroft had tolled its last, and Miss Elinor Ravenscroft could sleep in peace. In the end, that was the true measure of our success. Not the elegance of the solution or the cleverness of the trap, but the simple fact that an innocent woman had been freed from terror and could now live her life without fear of supernatural persecution or human malice. I slept soundly that night, and in the morning found Holmes already engaged with a new matter, something involving a forged will and a disputed inheritance in Cheltenham. The wheels of London's criminal underworld never ceased turning, and there was always another puzzle to solve, another mystery to unravel. But the memory of the Bell of Ravenscroft remained with me, a reminder that even in our modern age of railways and telegraphs and electric lights, the old darkness persists. The darkness of human cruelty and ambition, of greed and betrayal and murder. And against that darkness, we had only the light of reason and the determination to seek truth wherever it might lead, no matter how many shadows must be penetrated or how many comfortable illusions must be shattered. Holmes had once told me that his profession was its own reward, that the solving of a complex puzzle brought a satisfaction that no amount of monetary compensation could match, as I watched him pore over the documents of his new case that morning, his pipe clenched between his teeth and his long fingers sorting through papers with the precision of a surgeon performing a delicate operation. I understood what he meant. The satisfaction lay not in the acclaim or the gratitude, though both were welcome, but in the restoration of order where chaos had threatened, in the triumph of a truth over deception, and in the knowledge that one had used one's gifts in service of justice. The case of the Bell of Ravenscroft was closed, its mysteries solved, its villain apprehended. The silent bell would ring no more, save in memory and legend, and those who heard its story in future years would know that behind the supernatural facade lay nothing more mystical than catgut and leather, rosin and brass, and the ingenious malice of a desperate man. And if, as Holmes predicted, the legend persisted despite the exposure of its fraudulent nature, then perhaps that too was as it should be. For legends serve a purpose beyond mere historical accuracy. They remind us that the world contains both wonder and terror, that the line between the ordinary and the extraordinary is thinner than we imagine, and that eternal vigilance is required against those who would exploit our fears for their own gain. The Bell of Ravenscroft had tolled for the living, and a rogue had indeed found the rope. But in the end, justice had prevailed, truth had triumphed, and the innocent had been delivered from evil. In the great ledger of Holmes's career, it would be recorded as one more case successfully concluded, one more mystery solved, one more victory for reason over superstition and for law over lawlessness. And that, I reflected as I turned my attention to my own correspondence, was the real legacy of Sherlock Holmes. Not any single brilliant deduction or clever trap, but rather the cumulative effect of dozens, then hundreds, of cases in which he had stood against the forces of chaos and confusion, bringing light where there had been darkness and certainty where there had been doubt. He was, in the truest sense, a guardian of civilization, using the tools of science and logic to defend society against those who would undermine it from within. The morning sun streamed through our Baker Street windows, burning away the last traces of fog, and London awoke to another day of commerce and crime, of honest labour and criminal enterprise, of the great dance between order and chaos that defines human civilization. And in our rooms above the busy street, Sherlock Holmes pursued his calling with the same intense focus that had characterized his investigation of the Bell of Ravenscroft, searching always for truth, fighting always against falsehood, and bringing to bear upon each new mystery the full force of his remarkable intellect. The case was concluded, but the work went on. Such was the life we had chosen, Holmes and I would not have traded it for any other.